The war had ended, but its legacy lingered in the forgotten corners of Europe. Secret Nazi research facilities on the hoops of cutting-edge technology and dark experimentation were abandoned, left to decay or repurposed in the aftermath of destruction. The Allies rushed to secure the spoils of war, but these facilities were not easy to dismantle. The promises of technological superiority on the hidden within these walls now stood as ominous reminders of the cost of ambition. Could the world truly erase the mark left by the Nazi war machine? And what would become of the remnants of tired deadly genius in a world no longer at war?
As World War II came to an end, the world stood at a precipice. The horrors of the conflict were fresh in memory, and the task of rebuilding was massive. But one question echoed across the ravaged landscapes of Europe and beyond. What would become of the vast, sprawling network of secret Nazi research facilities that had fueled the war effort? These facilities, often hidden in plain sight within mountain bunkers, dense forests, and under the cover of darkened skies, were now left abandoned. Or were they? The end of the war didn't mean the end of the secrets they contained. Instead, the aftermath brought an uneasy quiet, the kind that follows when something much larger than a single nation's defeat hangs in the air. The machinery of war might have stopped, but the ideologies, technologies, and knowledge developed within these secretive installations lived on. With an enormous material and logistical effort now required to reorient the world's economies and military priorities, what was left of Nazi research had become both a liability and an opportunity. It was a moment of reckoning, but the decisions made in these uncertain days would define the fate of these hidden legacies. The collapse of the Nazi regime in May 1945 left behind an extraordinary web of secret laboratories, weapons facilities, and research hubs, many of which had operated far from public view. The scale of what had been constructed during the war was staggering. Some facilities had been deeply embedded within the Reich's most fortified zones, hidden in mountain caves or disguised in remote parts of the country. These places were dedicated to developing cutting-edge weaponry, rocket technology, biological warfare, and, most disturbingly, the pursuit of the Aryan ideal through disturbing medical experiments. All of them were designed to push the limits of science and technology in support of Nazi ambitions. Yet, by the time the Allies swept through Europe, most of these operations were no longer in full production. But the infrastructure, and the promise of what it represented, still remained. To say that the Allies were uncertain about what to do with it all would be an understatement. The immediate pressure was not only to prevent any further use of these facilities by the Nazis but to ensure that these dangerous secrets didn't fall into the hands of their former enemies. The Soviet Union, which had been advancing from the east, was closing in on many of these sites, just as American and British forces were arriving from the west. The race for these facilities began almost as soon as the fighting stopped. At first, the solution appeared simple: secure and dismantle. The most obvious route was to repurpose the resources, personnel, and intellectual property for the rebuilding efforts of the victorious Allies. Yet, this was a task far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Germany's defeat meant more than just the destruction of its military apparatus. It signified the dismantling of its entire war economy, including the scientific infrastructure that had been built to support it. The immediate aftermath saw a variety of options explored for dealing with the assets left behind. The U.S. and Soviet Union, eager to harness any potential technological advantage, began making rapid moves to seize and exploit Nazi assets. This took the form of intelligence missions and coordinated efforts to cart away scientists, researchers, and documents from these installations. They were keen to integrate the brightest minds from the Third Reich into their own post-war military-industrial complex. The American Operation Paperclip, which smuggled some of the most valuable German scientists to the United States, became notorious for its controversial inclusion of individuals involved in ethically questionable research. Among them were rocket scientists who had worked on the V2 program, including Wernher von Braun, who would go on to become a leading figure in the development of the U.S. space program. But the more mundane operations, the actual research facilities, the complex machinery, and the long-abandoned test sites, were left to rot or, at best, slowly be dismantled. Facilities such as the Piedmont Army Research Center, where the V-2 rockets had been developed, were captured but rarely repurposed. While the U.S. and the USSR hurried to secure the most advanced pieces of Nazi technology, much of the remaining infrastructure was viewed as either too dangerous or too outdated to make use of. In the post-war world, technological advance was no longer about grandiose military ambitions. The focus shifted to rebuilding war-torn economies. The infrastructure of war, the massive factories, research centers, and military complexes, simply couldn't be integrated into peacetime economies. The immense costs of maintaining these facilities were simply too high. In addition, many of the key figures who could have continued their work were either taken by the Allies or left in no position to continue. Without the production facilities or the raw materials to back them up, much of the technological research fizzled out. This reality was especially true for the more nefarious programs, such as those focused on biological warfare. The Nazi regime had pushed the boundaries of science with horrific experimentation on prisoners. These facilities, which once thrived under secrecy and terror, were now abandoned in the wake of their brutal goals. The remains of these sites were sealed off or destroyed. Some were left standing in the desolation of post-war Europe, their histories buried under decades of neglect. Others were simply demolished, as the victors turned their gaze to the future and away from the monstrous past. The logistical and material challenges of dealing with this vast web of sites were immense. Some research complexes were simply too large to dismantle or repurpose quickly, and many were left abandoned. Local populations, already suffering from the ravages of war, were reluctant to confront the dark past that these buildings represented. The decision to obliterate them or leave them standing was often made on a case-by-case basis, influenced by practical considerations and the political maneuvering of the Allies. For a time, there was the hope that some of these complexes could be converted into symbols of peace. The massive underground bunkers that once housed weapons programs were occasionally turned into scientific research centers. In the immediate aftermath of the war, these facilities did not simply disappear, they became the raw material for the new world being constructed. Yet the task was never as simple as redirecting their purpose. In the days following the war, one facility stood out among the rest in terms of its significance and its transformation, the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp complex. Originally used for the forced labor that contributed to the production of the V-2 rockets, the site became the focus of an almost immediate effort to erase its violent past. It was one of many such efforts to take the symbols of Nazi war machinery and turn them into something more palatable for the post-war world. Yet, despite these efforts, the complex's dark legacy would never fade. It served as a reminder that, no matter how hard the world tried to move on, the footprint of these secret facilities would always remain. As months turned into years, the fate of the Nazi research infrastructure was sealed in the annals of history. Some sites were preserved as part of the Cold War chess match, with the U.S. and the USSR vying for control of whatever was left. Yet, even in the most desperate attempts to reclaim the spoils of the past, many of these secret facilities, with all their promises of technological superiority, slipped into oblivion. They became no more than a testament to the unsustainable nature of the war effort they had once supported, too costly, too dangerous, and ultimately, too irrelevant to a world that had moved on. As the dust settled on Europe in the wake of World War II, the question of what would happen to the countless abandoned and secretive Nazi research facilities became a matter of not only logistical necessity but also political importance. The immediate post-war years were marked by a flurry of activity as the Allied powers, chiefly the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, rushed to secure the spoils of war. These facilities, once at the cutting edge of Nazi military and technological advancements, had become a commodity that the victors were desperate to either control or destroy. The complexity of this task was far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The scale of the Nazi war machine had been massive, and within its reach were numerous underground bunkers, hidden factories, and isolated laboratories. Some of the largest and most significant of these sites were designed specifically to produce advanced weaponry that had no place in a post-war world. V-2 rockets, jet engines, new tank designs, biological weapons, and even the early experiments in nuclear technology were being developed in secrecy. These weren't just remnants of a failed regime, they were harbingers of a future that could still threaten the peace. In the early months of 1945, as the Allied forces advanced and began to occupy former Nazi territory, the full scale of what lay hidden beneath the surface began to emerge. Some of the largest research sites, like Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea and the Mittelwerk underground facilities, were discovered in varying states of operation and disrepair. Peenemünde, for instance, had been the site of the V2 rocket program, the very same rockets that had terrorized London and other European cities during the war. The facility's significance was not lost on the Allies, and its capture by American forces in April 1945 marked the beginning of a complex process of decommissioning, repurposing, and sometimes abandoning these sites. While some of the advanced technologies had limited immediate post-war applications, the very existence of these facilities presented a tantalizing prize to the Allies. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, locked in what would become the Cold War, quickly realized the potential value of the scientists, engineers, and intellectual property that could be extracted from these research centers. The most famous of these efforts was Operation Paperclip, which saw over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians brought to the U.S. to work on American military and aerospace programs. Among these were some of the key figures behind the Nazi rocket program, most notably Wernher von Braun, who would later help develop the U.S. space program and, eventually, the Saturn V rocket that sent astronauts to the moon. The Soviet Union similarly pursued its own version of this recruitment, particularly in the realm of rocket technology, which would soon lead to the space race. However, these efforts to capitalize on the knowledge held by Nazi scientists created an ethical and moral dilemma. Many of these scientists had been involved in horrific practices, working on weapons that had been used to kill millions. Some had also participated in the experiments at concentration camps. The Allied powers, particularly the Americans, faced considerable backlash for their decision to offer these men a second chance at a new life, given their involvement in a regime responsible for such atrocities. Still, the Cold War tensions pushed these concerns into the background, as the need to secure technological advantages over the Soviet Union took precedence. Yet not all of the Nazi research facilities were as easily exploited. In many cases, the infrastructure itself was simply too vast, too damaged, or too impractical to repurpose. The underground bunkers, which had once been used for research and development, were now inaccessible due to the extensive damage they had suffered during the final days of the war. At some sites, large portions of the facilities were destroyed by retreating Nazi forces, who were determined to leave nothing behind for the Allies to use. These sites, even if they had been accessible, were often too specialized to have immediate use in the post-war world. For example, the Mittelbau-Dora complex, located in the Harz Mountains, was another major Nazi research and production site. While it had been integral to the development and production of the V2 rocket, the complex had also served as a concentration camp, where forced laborers were subjected to brutal conditions. The site itself was partially destroyed by the Nazis in their retreat, and much of the research equipment was either looted or left behind in ruins. The Allies, particularly the Soviets, did capture part of the V2 technology, but the overall site was not as easily turned into something useful. Meanwhile, many of the chemical weapons research facilities were also rendered obsolete by the end of the war. The Nazi chemical weapons program, which had once been a source of fear across Europe, was largely dismantled after the war. Facilities like the one at the town of Schweinfurt, where nerve agents and other chemical agents had been produced, were stripped of their equipment, and much of the research documentation was seized or destroyed. The Allies, in both Europe and the Pacific, had already developed their own stockpiles of chemical weapons, and as such, there was little interest in continuing the Nazi experiments in this area. Similarly, biological warfare programs, which had seen some of their most horrific experimentation conducted in places like the Buchenwald concentration camp, were either abandoned or shut down, and the facilities were repurposed or destroyed. As the 1940s drew to a close, the question of what to do with the remaining Nazi research facilities became less about their immediate military utility and more about their symbolic and historical significance. Many of these sites, which had once represented the pinnacle of Nazi technological prowess, were now viewed with a certain degree of historical revulsion. Some, like Peenemünde, were kept as symbols of past achievements that had led to tragedy. Others were simply too toxic to remain standing, and the costs of attempting to preserve them outweighed any potential benefits. Despite this, some facilities did find a second life. One of the more remarkable examples was the conversion of former Nazi military factories into post-war industrial hubs. In East Germany, for instance, former Nazi production sites were repurposed for civilian use, often under Soviet guidance. The large underground facilities built during the war for weapons production were adapted for new industries, such as manufacturing civilian goods or providing housing. In some cases, former military complexes were converted into research facilities for the development of peacetime technologies. This repurposing of Nazi war infrastructure was a practical response to the post-war shortage of industrial capacity in both Germany and the Soviet-occupied regions. In the West, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, many of the smaller research facilities were either shut down or forgotten. Some were demolished to make way for new construction, while others fell into neglect. Over time, these sites became relics of a past that the post-war world was eager to leave behind. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was more likely to preserve these sites as part of their drive to build a technological and scientific powerhouse. The V-2 rockets, for instance, served as the basis for the Soviet space program, as well as for the development of ballistic missiles.